Chapter 5, GWF. Blocker didn't wait until lunchtime. He waylaid Ben in the stairwell, pinning him against the wire-reinforced glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The clatter of kids' feet continued down below the landing, but those of us coming down above it were stopped as a knob of kids bunched up to watch Ben get the snot kicked out of him. There were 6 or 7 kids in front of me, mainly boys, and the stairs were blocked, so it seemed I was going to have to watch as well. I didn't want to. I was feeling uncommonly guilty. It hadn't been Ben's fault, really. It had been mine. If I hadn't made Führer Blüchner write knickers on the board, then Ben wouldn't be about to get his teeth kicked in. "Something funny in class?" Big, sneering Blocker Blüchner asked little Ben Holly, knowing he wouldn't answer. Ben just shook his head, terrified. "Here's a good joke," Blocker said, and punched Ben in the stomach, hard. Ben gasped and doubled up, clutching at his midriff. "You'll split your sides," Blocker said, and drew back his fist for another strike. I couldn't do nothing. It just wasn't fair. I aimed all of my attention at the back of Blocker's head and thought furiously, "Leave him alone, you big ugly ape! Leave him alone, you big ugly ape!" Blocker paused, one arm drawn back, and I slammed the thought again and again into his brain. "Leave him alone, you big ugly ape!" Then, to my horror, Blocker slowly turned and looked directly at me. To my even greater horror, I realized that the other kids were turning too, with looks of disbelief. Urgently, I replayed my mental videotape of the last few seconds and realized, to my immense fright, that the last one had not just been a mental projection of my thoughts. I'd been concentrating so hard that I had said the words out loud. "What did you say, freak?" Blocker asked, almost unable to comprehend that someone would be so stupid to say such a thing to him. "Nothing," I wanted to scream. "I didn't say anything," but it was far too late for that. "Leave him alone," I said out loud, and added, "Blockhead," and for a penny, and for a pound. Blocker started to move towards me, pushing through the crowd of kids gathered on the stairs, but just at that moment the sound of a door closing and locking came from the classroom above us. Führer Blüchner was on her way down. The kids quickly started to disperse down the stairs, and Blocker stopped where he was. "I'm going to get you, freak," he said, in a voice that was as low as it was deadly, and punctuated with a stabbing finger in my direction. Out of nowhere, another bizarre thought popped into my head, and I said, "You think you're so tough? I'll take you on. I'll take you on at GWF." There was a gasp from the crowd, and widened eyes of surprise on the bully's face. "You're on, freak," he said with a malicious sneer. "You are so dead." "Okay then," I said, wondering why kids like Blocker always spoke in such terrible cliches. "But in the meantime, try not to be so noisome." While he tried to work out what that meant, I pushed through the crowd and walked, much more casually than I felt, past Blocker, finally escaping down the lower flight of stairs and out into fresh air and freedom. I wasn't feeling all that clever, though, because unless I could come up with something, and fast, I was shortly going to be turned into mincemeat by the toughest son of a bum in the whole of Year 9. A hand caught me by the arm as I walked out of G Block, and I whirled around, expecting a fight, but it was Erica MacDonald. "You did a good thing," she said, in that beautiful burr of an accent. And for the first time in my life, I saw the smile that was bubbling just below the surface of her face, just for a brief flash. Then the Ice Queen was back, and before I could say anything, she was off, gliding down the path towards F Block. It was just a brief moment, and while it was a surprise, it really meant nothing to me at the time. Ben came and stood by me as I watched Erica glide away. He was rubbing his stomach and looking a bit confused. "Why did you stick up for me?" he asked in his perfectly controlled, but quite realistic-sounding, artificial voice. "No reason," I said. There was no way of explaining it. "Well, thanks," he said, and the way he said it conveyed such emotion that I found myself wondering if in fact he really was a robot after all. Maybe it was all the stress of the moment, or maybe it was something else, but I normally never would have said what I said next. "Are you a robot?" I asked, and winced as I said it, realizing how silly it sounded when you said it aloud like that. "What?" Ben gave me a real funny look. Once started, though, I had to continue. "Are you a real kid, or are you a robot?" "I'm a kid," Ben said emphatically. "A real kid. Well, you walk like a robot." There was silence while he digested that. "Do I?" he asked at last. "Yeah. Are you sure you're not a robot? Maybe your creators wouldn't tell you. Maybe they'd want you to think you were a real kid." "Oh." Ben looked more and more confused. "Right. I hadn't thought of that. How would we tell?" I thought about that for a moment, then said, "We could cut one of your arms open and see if there's wires and stuff inside." "Ouch," said Ben, quite calmly, really, considering what I was suggesting. "But what if you were wrong? There'd be blood everywhere." "Oh, yeah, I suppose." We started to head down the path in the same direction as Erica MacDonald. "Do you have a mum and dad?" I asked, thinking he might live in a laboratory or something. "Yes," Ben Holly said, "just like other kids." "Are there any photos of you as a baby?" It would be a dead giveaway if there weren't. But Ben said, "Yes, just like other kids." "And what happens when you go home after school?" I asked, still searching for clues. "Nothing," he said. "I go home, do my homework, then go to bed, and Mum plugs me into the charger for the night, just like other kids." I turned and stared at him in shock, and it took me a moment or two to realise that he was joking. Then Ben Holly walked alongside me to physics class, and we got to talking a little bit more, and I kind of liked his sense of humour, and I realised that I'd better be careful or I'd end up having a friend.